Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today we're looking at a compilation of the videos that I did responding to John Morris Pendleton back in 2020. So it's a nice trip down memory lane. If you'd prefer to watch the original videos, I'll leave a card to the playlist, but this is all of them smushed together into one, because some people prefer it that way. And it's December, so realistically this is an easy way for me to not take a pay cut while taking some time off to spend with family. So enjoy this blast from the past. Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a classic creationist video. This is one that probably would have faded into obscurity if Logic hadn't done a series on him back in 2012, but every now and then I see his name pop up in my comments, and today I thought, what the heck, I'll do my own take on the guy. I'm speaking, of course, of self-styled chemist and scientist John Morris Pendleton, who puts on a lab coat and introduces himself as a chemist for his videos, but fixes cars when he's not moonlighting as a fake scientist. Seriously though, search for his name in any database of scientific publications, and you're more likely to find papers by the midwife from the UK, who happens to also be named John Pendleton, than you are to find anything from this John Pendleton. Now, as I have pointed out numerous times before, qualifications aren't everything. I myself am not qualified in chemistry, and Johnny here actually does have some formal education on the subject, so he's closer to being able to call himself a chemist than I am. The difference is that I'm not artificially inflating my credentials in order to lend myself credibility. I am completely honest about my lack of qualifications. That's one of the reasons that I always have a source list in my description. But enough background, let's see what the guy actually says.
Hello once again, I'm chemist John Morris Pendleton.
Hello, chemist John Morris Pendleton, who doesn't actually do any chemistry-related work. I'm video producer Rhino. See? I can make my title sound more important than it actually is, too. And as a bonus, I actually do produce videos.
And we're now in our 5th conference, and this is one of the really exciting ones, because I know it's a question that lots of people have. What is the age of the Earth?
Current estimates place the age of the Earth at 4.543 billion years old, based mostly on the radiometric dating of zircon crystals using uranium-lead series dating, which happens to be one of the dating methods that can be used with the isochron diagram, since there is a non-radiogenic isotope of lead. For those of you who may not remember, a radiometric dating method that can be used with the isochron diagram is one where the initial conditions that creationists complain about being assumptions are directly tested. Uranium series dating is one of the most accurate dating methods that we have.
When did the creation actually occur? And of course, we're going to go to the Bible.
Because naturally, when a chemist is doing their work, they first turn to the Bible. Because the Bible has answers for everything, right? The Bible certainly shows signs of knowing what atoms are and how their electrons interact with each other, right?
Now, by comparison, looking at 2 timelines, one of what the Bible says, one of what evolutionists say.
Only those 2? Well, an evolutionist might be tempted to start their timeline when evolution started, so that would be a bit over 3 billion years ago. What about the gravitationalists? Their timeline probably begins about the same time as the universe. How about the thermodynamicists, the relativists, the plate tectonicists? Just because you don't like a certain branch of science doesn't mean you just get to put an ist on the end of it and lump everyone who accepts that branch of science into a category of people who you like to think just accept that branch of science without critical evaluation.
We have the creation of everything happened about 6,000 years ago. About 4,400 years ago, the worldwide flood occurred, of which 8 people were saved.
That is quite the genetic bottleneck. You'd think we'd be able to see some evidence of that happening if we were to examine our genome, which we don't. Closest we see is a bottleneck event some 70,000 years ago, where humanity dwindled to a population of just a few thousand individuals. So, pretty severe, but also a few orders of magnitude larger than the 8 people that you are suggesting. And what's more, it's possible that the appearance of the genetic marks that make us think bottleneck could just be the result of humans leaving Africa in several small waves, rather than all at the same time. So, the last population bottleneck for humans still has orders of magnitude more survivors than your hypothesis, abiogenesis, and it might not even have been a bottleneck. So, given this, do you have any evidence to support your position, aside from an ancient Hebrew myth that has its roots in an earlier Babylonian myth?
Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary 2,000 years ago, and we expect that maybe in the next 5 minutes that he could come back again to rule the earth.
That event has been about 5 minutes away for the last 2,000 years. Case in point, I have no idea when this video was originally recorded, but the channel I found it on uploaded it in 2006. If someone told you that they were expecting their friend to join the party any minute now, would you still be patiently waiting for their friend 14 years later? Or would you perhaps suspect that they might have been mistaken long before that?
Are you ready? He could come back. He is coming back, and it could be soon.
Way to hedge your bets there, John. It could be soon, but it could also be another 2,000 years. Side note, but the whole Jesus coming back any minute now and the end of the world thing just got me thinking. One of my favorite things to do when the Jehovah's Witnesses come knocking is to let them get to their part about all the horrible things that are happening in the world, and then bring up the fact that, historically speaking, this is the best time to be alive so far. We live in a society where often the poor have a better quality of life than royalty of only a couple hundred years ago. Crime has been on a significant decline in the last 25 years. Technology is such that I get a notification on my phone if my kids don't show up to school, and you can buy watches with GPS trackers on them so that if your kid goes missing, you can find them faster. The only reason things always seem to be getting worse is because our communication has gotten so much better. If a kid went missing in LA in the 60s, people in New York were not likely to hear about it. But now, everyone can know. So we hear about more crimes than we're used to, giving us the impression that there are more crimes. Meanwhile, the actual crime rates are dropping sharply. The poor JWs don't usually know what to do with this information. They're just used to people agreeing that these are indeed terrible times that we're living in.
Now, according to the Big Bang Theory and evolution, it was about 20 billion years ago. There was a big bang, a big explosion.
Close. It was 13.8 billion years ago. You're only off by 6.2 billion years. That's not a lot, right? Just a rounding error? Because obviously 13.8 rounds up to 20, right? Also, pretty sure evolution doesn't say anything about the origin of the universe, so there's that.
Millions and millions of years went by. 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth was formed.
Well, that one's closer. Now, to be fair, this video is old enough that maybe scientists were saying that the universe is 20 billion years old and the Earth is 4.6 billion years old when it was filmed. I don't know, and I don't really care enough to look into it, so let's just keep going.
From where, they don't know?
No, they know. It was the accretion disk of debris that the entire solar system formed out of. This debris was mostly formed through stellar fusion in the cores of other stars that had already gone through their whole life cycle before our sun began its cycle, and the heavier elements would have been formed during the violent explosions of these earlier stars.
Collected water began raining on the Earth, and 3 billion years ago, the first life forms appeared, which survived, had something to eat, and were interested and able to reproduce themselves into all the forms we have today.
Slow down there, Sparky. You're skipping over a lot of steps and oversimplifying to the point of absurdity. Where exactly the Earth's water came from is not known for certain, but that being said, hydrogen is by far the most common element in the galaxy and probably in the universe, with oxygen being the third most common element. Given that water is 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, a relative abundance of water in the universe is expected, and since we see water in various forms scattered all over our solar system, it's not surprising that one of the planets happens to have a lot of water on it. Water is also an almost universal solvent, meaning that most things can dissolve in water. So we have Earth, still really hot, collecting water, water evaporating into the atmosphere, and then raining down on the Earth again, dissolving different minerals and compounds as it goes. But when it evaporates again, it leaves the minerals and compounds behind, leading them to increase in concentration, eventually leading to life. This is one of several abiogenesis hypotheses, and it's a creationist favorite because it's the one that leads them to the erroneous statement that evolutionists believe we evolved from a rock. This is only true in the very loosest of senses, in the same way that I could say that you are made of rocks because your body is made of roughly 4% minerals. But no, the first thing that we might actually call a living organism would likely have had some minerals in its composition, but that does not make it a rock, even if it was mostly minerals. I mean, it was probably mostly water, just as life today is mostly water, so saying that it was a rock is less accurate than saying that a person is a lake. So Kent Hovind, if you're listening to this, maybe change it up a bit, and instead of saying, oh, evolutionists think we evolved from a rock, you should switch it to evolutionists think we evolved from a lake, because that's actually probably closer to the truth than the rock one. I mean, it's still horribly inaccurate, but it's slightly less horribly inaccurate than your usual line. But John hasn't said that yet, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt for now. Back on track, they had something to eat. Well, the first organism would have just been absorbing the components that it needed from its surroundings. Being interested in reproducing is a weird way to phrase that. It wouldn't have had the capacity to have interests, it just would have happened. And so far, we haven't even gotten to the hard part of abiogenesis, figuring out what the first genetic molecule would have been, because there are some genuine difficulties with abiogenesis. After all, if there weren't any difficulties, this wouldn't be an active area of research. But the simple parts that we've done here, the moving, eating, and reproducing, they have already been replicated in a lab setting. It only takes 5 chemicals, including water. It was so easy that the researchers had to purposely and literally muddy the waters. 5 chemicals was too simple. There wouldn't have been anywhere on the Earth where only these 5 pure chemicals collected. There would have been a big muddy mess of chemicals. So they did the same experiments again, but this time with some complex organic black tar that would have been similar in composition to the kinds of compounds found on the early Earth, with the same results. So, John, are you saying that these oil droplets with organic tar inside them had interests? Or were they maybe just behaving according to the laws of physics and chemistry?
Now, where do we get the idea from the Bible that the creation of everything happened 6,000 years ago?
By adding up a bunch of genealogies, of course. And this is a reliable method because it has never been demonstrated to be possible to write down a genealogy with inaccuracies in it.
In the Bible, beginning with chapter 5 of Genesis, we have genealogies. And we start with Adam, and it gives the age of the father when a key son was born in the line that eventually reached to Jesus Christ.
Yeah, sure. So we can either trust genealogies written by people who sometimes write things down wrong for one reason or another, or we can trust the uranium-lead dating of zircon crystals with the isochron diagram, which is independently verifiable data that is not subject to human opinions and biases. Which one of these methods do you suppose is more accurate? Okay, I know John thinks the genealogies are more accurate, but really, looking at it objectively, we have genealogies from other sources that we know are not accurate. Julius Caesar was not a descendant of Romulus and Remus. Since we know that genealogies can be recorded inaccurately, why would we trust a genealogy over radiometric dating?
And so we begin adding up these ages, and we come up that the flood occurred 1,656 years after the creation.
Pretend genealogies that give a time frame for a pretend flood. Okay. Any evidence for this flood at all? No? Wait, there's actually a bunch of evidence against a worldwide flood? Now I'm skipping ahead a bit. He's just continuing to add genealogies until you get to Jesus.
That's a total of about 4,000 years. From Christ to today is 2,000. 4 plus 2 is 6,000 years.
Indeed. But what evidence do you have to suggest that any of these genealogies are actually accurate and reliable? Are you just assuming it because you start with the assumption that the Bible is accurate? For those of us who don't have this as a starting assumption, could you please help us get there? You know, with, like, evidence and stuff?
Now let me give you a little suggestion. When God reveals a truth in His Word, He reveals it many, many times from different angles in different ways.
That is wise. Doing it from many, many angles and different ways is more likely to leave all parties satisfied.
Now, from the evolutionary standpoint, their clock is called the geological time scale.
That's one of them, sure. That's not the one that gives us the age of the universe, though, just the age of the Earth.
The idea is this. These numbers here represent millions of years in the evolutionary time scale.
I thought it was the geologic timescale. Make up your mind, would you?
And the idea is that the oldest rocks are furthest in the earth. On top of them are younger rocks. On top of them are younger rocks. And so goes the sequence.
Generally speaking, yes. Though certainly an inversion after the fact is possible. Usually, though, an inversion refers to an area where old rock has been uplifted to a point where some of it is physically higher than its younger neighboring rock, than actually the flipping of the sequence upside down. But yeah, it is a basic fact of geology that the sediment that will make up sedimentary rock layers will be deposited nearly horizontal with the oldest material on the bottom, because that's how gravity works. You can test this yourself. Dig a hole in the ground and then throw a bunch of sand in. After the sand is settled, throw a bunch of gravel in. I'd be willing to bet that when you're done, the sand will be mostly on the bottom, with a few grains here and there having poofed up and mixed with the gravel when the gravel hit it.
Now, we asked the evolutionist, where can we go in the world to see exactly, in sight, these layers of rocks exactly as you've laid out there?
And the answer is almost nowhere, because billions of years is a long time and things like earthquakes happen. And the Earth is not some homogeneous system where deposition is happening universally over the whole planet at the same time. In some places, there is no deposition. In others, there is a lot of deposition. But there are a couple of places where all of the major geologic periods are represented. North Dakota is one such place. And what's more, when you look at all of the layers individually, it becomes clear that none of them could have been caused by a global flood. My favorite example is the Madison group of the Mississippian, where enough crinoid remains are found that had they all been alive simultaneously, it would have been enough to cover the entire planet to a depth of 3 inches. And that's just one small segment of this Mississippian crinoid bed. It is an almost worldwide formation being found in Arizona, Colorado, Alaska, England, Belgium, Western Canada, Russia, Egypt, Libya, Central Asia, and Australia. So, just the North Dakota section can cover the planet in 3 inches of dead crinoids. How much deeper in crinoid corpses would we be if we were to calculate it for all of these locations? If it's just 3 inches per location, that's 3 feet of crinoids covering the entire surface of the planet at one time. The only way to have that many crinoids exist is to have their existence span tens of millions of years.
We're thinking, where could we go? Oh, I know. We could go to the Grand Canyon in Arizona.
Yeah, you could go there. Not all of the geologic periods are represented there, but the Grand Canyon is an excellent place to study geology. And when actually studied, rather than just superficially glanced at, it makes it entirely obvious that its layers were formed slowly over millions of years, not instantly in 1 year. If you want more detail on that and how we know several of the individual depositional environments of the Grand Canyon, I discuss that in more detail in this video. Link is in the card in the corner and in the description.
That hole is almost a mile deep. We have all kinds of layers of rock. Guess what? About 50% of them are missing.
They're only missing if you'd expect them to be everywhere. But as I mentioned, deposition is not a universal event. Local environments do exist. Shocking, I know. But to have a complete geologic record of every geologic time period is expected to be the exception rather than the rule, and that's exactly what we see. Now, that being said, a global flood would certainly be a global event, right? So if the layers were deposited in a single year-long global flood, we would expect all of the layers to be universally represented no matter where we dig. And as you yourself are pointing out, that's just not the case. So one more line of evidence against Noah's flood. Thanks for that. Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today we continue on with the mechanic/chemist who is out to prove a young Earth. Let's see how he does this time.
Also, as you can see in this next transparency, from Canada into the United States, all this red area is called Precambrian rock.
That is a very American-centric map of the Canadian Shield. I like this one better. Yes, that is a formation of Precambrian rock, more properly known as Precambrian rock. This is where you'll find some of the oldest rocks on the planet, and a lot of the Precambrian rock has been uplifted and younger rock eroded away to a point where the older rock is exposed on the surface. Geologic inversion, I think that was called.
This is rock that's even older than 600 million years, and the younger rock is underneath it.
Yeah, inversion. It happens.
In other words, the whole thing is turned upside down.
No, it's not upside down. If you dig through the Precambrian rock of the Canadian Shield, you don't find younger rock buried beneath it. It's just that if you move laterally, you will sometimes find layers of younger rock deposited lower than the Precambrian rock that is beside it. Basic mistake, easy enough to understand. Inversion usually means something that has been flipped completely upside down, but you're wrong, and it's not hard to find this information. So if you didn't do enough digging, pun intended, to figure out what geologists mean when they say inversion as opposed to laypeople, then how can we trust your other scientific conclusions, or rather unscientific conclusions?
Actually, there's only one place in the world that you can go to consistently find, consistently see these layers of rock is laid out. You know where it's at?
There are two locations that I am aware of, so you're likely to either say North Dakota or Australia. Either that, or you're just mindlessly parroting other creationists and you're about to say, in the textbooks.
In the books.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I expected better of you. I should have known better than that.
I told you, they're good at making fascinating drawings of things that don't exist.
Good one. It will take me a while to recover from that sick burn.
That is not science,
Says the mechanic pretending to be a chemist who misunderstands basic geological terminology.
They say this, that over millions of years ago, there were worms living at the bottom of the oceans and the seas. But through millions of years and some favorable accidents, some of them changed into fish.
Kind of. Not really, though.
More favorable accidents and more millions and millions of years, some of them changed into amphibians, as a frog. With more favorable accidents and millions of years, some of them changed into primates, then into chimpanzee, and finally into our professor of biology.
Nope. I mean, you sort of have the gist of it. Over millions of years, small adaptations accumulate, making the descendants quite different from their ancestors, leading to, say, a fish with lungs that can walk and live outside of water. Sounds far-fetched, I know, but the thing is, the ray-finned version of that fish exists. Like, today. As in, you can go to a fish store and buy one to put in your aquarium right now. Just make sure you read about them first. They're not the easiest guys to take care of. But these fish have been successfully raised terrestrially by scientists. That is, they raised them on land. And as a bonus, due to a biological mechanism known as phenotypic plasticity, within one generation, there was relatively large-scale change that helped them adapt to life on land. If that's not a transitional species, I don't know what is. But also, humans and chimps are cousins. Chimps are not our ancestors. We share a common ancestor with them, but they are not that ancestor.
Now, for evolution, millions of years is indispensable for by chance happenings that this evolutionary process can take place.
Well, it's also indispensable to allow enough time for all the organisms that we have direct fossil evidence for to have existed. Like, remember being buried by 3 feet of crinoids? Now look at the nearly global chalk beds, which are formed from the remains of coccolithophores, and are about 1.5 kilometers thick. They can be found all over the world. Just looking at these two formations, we have just 2 categories of animals that wouldn't have been able to coexist due to a severe lack of resources. But with the creation hypothesis, these 2 categories of animal had to coexist all at one time in their entirety with every other category of animal from the history of the planet as well. Spread their existence out over a few tens of millions of years, and it's not a problem. Insist that they all died in the flood of Noah, and we don't just have a boat with too many animals on it, we have too many animals existing simultaneously, period.
Obviously, if I had a worm here and say that at the end of my talk this would be a professor of biology, you say you're making fun of the biologist.
No, I'd say that's a completely invalid comparison. But if I showed you a microscopic tadpole-looking thing and told you that it could turn into a human baby in 9 months, that is quite the drastic little transition there, but it happens all the time. But that's also an invalid comparison. It just serves to demonstrate that the absurdity of transforming a worm into a human isn't quite as absurd as creationists would have you believe. Like, seriously, have you ever seen semen? It is a gross, slimy puddle of goo. And yet this puddle of slimy goo is capable of transforming into a human within a period of months. But the idea that humanity could have evolved from something like a slimy puddle of goo over hundreds of millions of years is just too big a leap, apparently.
But if I say over a period of millions and millions of years, the worm became a professor of biology, you say, oh, that's quite believable?
Again, no. Because no individual organism transforms itself into a different kind or species or type or whatever other term you want to use. It's just differences between parents and their children accumulated over time.
Anyway, let's take a look at some clocks. One of the first clocks that we have is the delta at the end of the great river Mississippi by New Orleans that empties out into the Gulf of Mexico.
The Mississippi River Delta, the delta whose origins are in the Cretaceous period some 100 million years ago, that delta? How is that going to help you demonstrate that the Earth is only 6,000 years old? I mean, sure, the modern version of the delta is about 8,000 years old, which generally fits into the 6 to 10,000 year range that creationists give to the Earth, but its geologic history goes back 100 million years.
Now, those in search of oil have drilled both in the Gulf of Mexico as well as into the continental USA, which means into that landmass which comprises the delta. Now they observe what is deposited dirt, what is virgin dirt, as they drill down into the ground.
What exactly is virgin dirt as opposed to deposited dirt? There is a song by a band called Let Live titled Virgin Dirt, and I found an article about a soil scientist on a mission to preserve areas in the US where the soil remains unaffected by humans, but virgin dirt doesn't seem to be a geologic term.
And so from that we can know how extensive was the delta, how deep it was, how much dirt is deposited there. Also, we can measure how much water is flowing and sediments bringing.
And you compare the present-day measurement of the rate of deposition, extrapolate that into the past as if it's a constant, ignore erosion, and find that this leaves us with an age for the delta of 4,000 years because otherwise the deposition would extend farther into the ocean or something. Am I right?
I read one figure that some 30,000 tons of dirt are brought down every hour. And so with those things put together, we find that the whole delta, this is what a delta looks like. It's when a river flows into a larger body of water.
Guys, if you ever wonder why I script my videos out in advance, it's because I would sound almost as bad as this if I were just speaking off the cuff. Buddy here really needs a script.
The water slows and the sediments it carries begin to accumulate, forming that landmass called a delta. This whole Mississippi River Delta could have been formed in 6 to 10,000 years.
What? Really? You think the delta formed before the flood? How did it survive the flood? How is it not buried in all the sediment that the flood was supposed to have laid down? You pointed out yourself earlier that the Grand Canyon is over a mile deep. It's 1.83 kilometers deep at its deepest. And most of it is made of sedimentary rock, the sediments deposited in Noah's flood, according to creationists. But here you are saying that the Mississippi River Delta is 6 to 10,000 years old, meaning that it formed before the flood and somehow managed to remain constant through the flood? If it formed that long ago, shouldn't it be buried under a couple kilometers of rock layers?
Now, mind you, they don't take into consideration that there had been a worldwide flood, after the which maybe half of that delta Earth had come down in the first 100 years or so.
Oh, okay, I get it. You think there were differing rates of deposition. The accepted age of the modern delta is 7,500 to 8,000 years. That's fairly young geologically speaking, but it's too old for your flood. So half of its deposition happened quickly in the first 100 years after the flood. So how do you explain the 6 delta complexes that are found there, which have each been explained by geologists through normal geologic processes? There are 2 pre-flood and 4 post-flood. Would you suggest that 2 of them happened in the first century after the flood, and then the other 4 happened in the time frame that we generally accept? Because that seems rather arbitrary, almost like it's a post hoc rationalization of your a priori beliefs.
It indicates a young Earth. What is the oldest living thing on Earth today?
The short answer is that we don't know for sure because we haven't done an exhaustive survey of every individual organism on the planet. But the oldest individual organism that we know of is a bristlecone pine that is over 5,065 years old. The oldest clonal organism that we know of is the Pando forest in Utah, whose root system is about 80,000 years old. And if we include dormant in our definition of living, we found dormant bacterial spores in the gut of a bee that was encased in amber some 25 to 40 million years ago, and we were able to successfully revive them. So, depending on what you count, the oldest living organism was either 5,000 years old, 80,000 years old, or 25 million years old. Now sure, the bacterial spores in the bee could have survived through the flood, so we can ignore that one. But both the Pando forest and the bristlecone pine would have been destroyed in the flood. Since they are both older than the flood, that means the flood did not happen, at least not on the timescale that you are claiming.
Please, no family jokes or things of that nature. The oldest living thing is called the bristlecone pine. It's also called the Methuselah pine. It is about 4,300 years old.
Yeah, it's not surprised that he's working from old data on that one, seeing as how old this video is. The tree that he's referring to is no longer the oldest known living bristlecone pine, with the one that I am referring to having been discovered in 2012.
Whoa, what happened 4,300 years ago? Well, according to the Bible, there was a worldwide flood.
Yep, and according to science, a bunch of organisms survived through that worldwide flood, and a bunch of human cultures. So I'm going to go with Old Book Full of Myths being wrong on this one.
They completely revamped all the real estate. Plants, animals, and people began to populate the earth about 4,400 years ago. Interesting. How come we don't have anything living older than 4,300 years?
Well, we do, but even if we didn't, that wouldn't prove anything. 4,000 years is a long time for us biological organisms. Most things don't live anywhere near that long. This line of evidence is like looking at the oldest living human, Kane Tanaka, seeing that she is 117 years old, and declaring that humanity has only been around for 117 years, because the oldest living human is 117 years old. What happened 117 years ago that wiped out all the humans? Must have been a flood. Nah, people just usually die before that, that's all. Nothing special there. Maybe most organisms on the planet die before reaching 4,000 years old. Did that thought occur to you? Oh yeah, and also, I let him get away with the bristlecone pine thing earlier because he was working from old data, but as it turns out, Methuselah, the tree that he is referring to, is actually about 4,800 years old, so flood being 4,400 years ago, it survived the flood as well.
And they're about 4,000 years old. Now, what's the reason that the bristlecone pine and the sequoia trees are so old? Two reasons. One is their resistance to plant diseases, as well as their resistance to forest fires.
You're right. It's almost like there are things that happen that tend to kill things before they can reach great ages like that, and it takes a particularly resilient organism to survive that long, meaning that only having a handful of organisms that reach great ages like that is the norm.
Indicates a young Earth.
No, it indicates a couple of old trees.
Another clock that indicates a young Earth is the world's population.
Oh God, no. Don't. Your arguments are already pathetic enough as it is without having to go to the argument that assumes that humanity would keep expanding indefinitely regardless of resource availability, disease, war, and any other population-limiting factors. Like, seriously, this argument is completely debunked by the existence of disease and the scarcity of resources. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip right past it. Actually, I'll save the skipping for the next segment. That's enough of him for today. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Neko Ajic, who says, "When they say that we're going to learn something new from the Bible, I hear them saying that they're going to massage whatever new we're going to learn into the text. When you have a text that's so vague, you can read into it pretty much anything you like." Couple of things. Firstly, yeah, I generally agree that when a preacher or apologist says it, this is likely where they're headed. But it is entirely possible for a scholar or historian to learn something new about an ancient culture from a text. But more to the point, ancient rabbis tended to be of the opinion that a text was only useful so long as it could be reinterpreted in new ways and new meanings could be found. I'm not sure if that tradition goes back to when Genesis was first written down, but if it does, then it is entirely possible that the original authors never intended it to be just a plain reading literal text, and they would be appalled at the way young Earth creationists insist on interpreting it. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons. See you next time. Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, we're looking back in on our mechanic/chemist, John Morris Pendleton. When we last left him, he was about to get into the argument for a young Earth from the human population, which is quite possibly one of the silliest arguments that creationists have. I was just considering skipping it outright, but it might be entertaining, so let's just have a quick look-see.
Another clock that indicates a young Earth is the world's population. A few years ago, we passed above 6 billion people in the world.
And about 9 years ago now, we got to 7 billion. We're currently sitting at about 7.6 billion.
We want to make a calculation backwards to find out how much time will it take to have 6 billion people alive on the Earth.
What an odd way to phrase that. I think what you're trying to say is that you want to extrapolate the population growth rate into the past and see how long ago the population would have been down to 8 individuals if you assume a constant growth rate.
Again, I propose an average number of 150 years to duplicate the living population on the Earth.
Where did you get that number from? Doesn't really matter, because one of the first things that you find when you start looking into population doubling times is that there are what are called resistance factors that prevent the doubling from continuing unabated forever, which is linked to the carrying capacity, which is essentially the maximum number of organisms that can be handled by their environment at one time. If a population is under the carrying capacity, it will grow. If it is above it, it will shrink. This is the morbid equilibrium that I've referred to in other videos. If an organism reproduces beyond the carrying capacity, then there will be starvation and disease that bring that population back down under the capacity.
Again, I realize there's times it takes more time than that, times it's taken less time than that.
Okay, so it is a variable rate depending on the circumstances. Knowing this, why would we use it as a constant for any real calculation? And 150 years ago, the world population was between 1 and 2 billion. It didn't get to 3 billion until 1960. So we're supposed to trust your calculation when the first iteration can't even be close to correct?
But to get an idea. So we start out with 6 billion people, count back 150 years, and take half of that number, which is 3 billion. We add another 150 years and take half of the previous figure. Keep adding 150 and take a half.
We're going backwards, John. I think you want to subtract 150 years.
As we scroll down to the bottom of the page, we see that after 4,500 years, there would only be 5.5 people left.
You can't even get to the right answer with your method. It's supposed to be 8 people. And also, using these numbers, that means that Pharaoh Pepi I ruled over the 6th dynasty of Egypt with less than 10 people in it. Significantly less, given that these less than 10 people had to also be in Central America, Asia, Australia, Europe, and Africa, in addition to the Middle East. So your first iteration of this calculation is wrong, and your last iteration is wrong. What does that say about the middle?
Whoa. What happened 4,500 years ago? Well, according to the Bible, there was a worldwide flood that cleared the whole earth, and only 8 people survived.
Notice that 8 is not 5.5. To get from 5.5 to 8 people, you need a margin of error of 45%, if I calculated correctly. That seems a touch on the large side, if you ask me.
Just think, with 8 people and 4,500 years of time, we could have the Earth's population today of over 6 billion people.
Well, considering the fact that the Earth's population remained under 1 billion for hundreds of thousands of years, I'd say this whole argument is a non-starter. We didn't get to 1 billion people until around the year 1800. Using your numbers, that means that we should get to 4 billion people around the year 2100. No matter what angle we look at this calculation from, the numbers don't end up matching reality, like not even a little bit. This should be the biggest reddest flag that you can imagine.
It agrees with what the Bible says, indicates a young Earth.
If you have to use such an obviously flawed formula that never produces data that matches with reality in order to get something that agrees with what the Bible says, then what does that say about what the Bible says?
But let's be generous. Let's say the first human couple lived 45,000 years ago. 1 man, 1 woman, modern human beings. Year 0. 150 years go by, now we're 4. We go to 300 years, now we're 8. Follow out that calculation, how many would we be today?
There would be 4 times 10 to the 90th people today if we used that calculation, which is more people than there are atoms in the universe. Now, I know the easy rebuttal to this is the whole concept of carrying capacity, that there are only so many living humans that the Earth can support at any one time, regardless of how fast we reproduce. And to think that it would even be physically possible for the population to get to that point is just an astounding oversight on the creationist part. But let's just go for a different route. The unstated assumption here is that an organism will continue to reproduce without limit at the same growth rate. So let's look at seahorses. In some species of seahorse, the males will give birth to 2,000 babies, or fry, at a time. And yes, if you're not familiar with seahorse reproduction, I did say the males are the ones giving birth. The females deposit their eggs in the male's brooding pouch, and then the males give birth to them in a process that looks like sneezing, but instead of snot, it's children.
That is how a seahorse do.
An estimated 5 of these 2,000 seahorse fry can survive until adulthood. Now, on the long end of the scale, the male carries the eggs for about 45 days, and the male can mate immediately after giving birth. So in 45 days, we go from an initial population of 2 seahorses to a new population of 7 seahorses. This gives us a growth rate of 2.8% and a doubling time of 24.9 days. So after 4,000 years, you end up with 4.6 times 10 to the 48th seahorses. So not quite as many seahorses as atoms in the universe, but that's only 2 orders of magnitude away from equaling the number of atoms on the Earth total. But it's actually more problematic than that, because when I first did this calculation, I forgot to convert my units. So as it turns out, that's actually only after 4,000 days, so only just under 11 years. So I plugged in the 1.46 million days that it would convert to, and the number was so big that I broke the calculator. I did plug in some dummy numbers just to verify that the calculator I was using could at least get to the number of atoms in the universe, and it can. So that's a lot of seahorses. And I didn't even get into the really fast reproducing organisms like bacteria, so yeah, it's almost like there are other factors that limit population growth than just how quickly they reproduce and how long they've been around.
Wow, we'd be standing chest against back, shoulder against shoulder, arms upon legs upon shoulders, miles up in the air, covering the whole surface of the Earth.
No, with your numbers, we would have expanded to every corner of the universe and then some. But you see, the thing is, it's hard for people who haven't developed any space-related technology to reproduce out in space, seeing as how some 99% of the space in the universe is an almost certain death sentence for anyone that finds himself there unprotected. But sure, humans would have just kept doubling their population in spite of this.
We are not that many people. We do not find that many human artifacts, remains, or bones.
Same can be said of seahorses, which should have clogged the oceans a long time ago, according to your logic.
It indicates a young Earth, just like the Bible says.
No, it indicates that limited resources will place limits on population size and density, nothing more.
Now, some in my audience will be saying, fine, John, that's all well and good.
If anyone can come out the other side of that argument saying, fine, that's all well and good, then they were already on your side to begin with. It is a lousy argument.
But carbon-14 proves that everything is really, really old.
No, it doesn't. Though it certainly does demonstrate that there are a lot of things that are older than creationists think the universe is, which is more than a bit problematic for you guys.
First of all, how is carbon-14 made? Carbon-14 is made in that a cosmic ray hits nitrogen-14 and changes into carbon-14.
So far, so good.
Carbon is normally carbon-12. Carbon-14 is unstable. We call it radioactive, in that it's unstable and gives off an emission that eventually reverts back to nitrogen-14.
I'm impressed. That is actually a decent, if simplistic, explanation of the process.
Now, all living things are made up of carbon, and some is carbon-14. Clams, algae, fish, birds, trees, animals, humans, all have lots of carbon, and some is carbon-14. While these things are living, there's a balance. But when there's death, there's a loss of carbon-14.
Okay, that last bit was more than a touch awkward. When an organism is alive, it will absorb carbon-14 from its environment, and it will also expel carbon-14 from its body into its environment. This will cause it to roughly balance out. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in a tree will be the same as the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. Animals eat plants, or they eat animals that eat plants, and so this material is incorporated into their bodies, so the ratio in animals will, through similar metabolic processes, be the same as in plants and in the atmosphere, with a few well-documented exceptions, particularly for marine organisms. Terrestrial organisms get their carbon pretty much directly from the atmosphere, or indirectly through consuming an organism that does. Marine organisms, though, they get their carbon from the water, and the carbon content of the surface of the water is not the same as the deeper water, and as the deeper water mixes with the surface water, it skews the ratio to make marine samples look older than they are. Marine samples can be carbon dated, but you have to jump through a lot more hoops to do it than you would with a terrestrial organism.
The idea is if we could find out how much carbon-14 is left in something, we could know how long it's been dead. That's what the theory proposes. Now, they suppose lots of things, one of which, for example, is how much carbon-14 was there 2,000 years ago? We don't know. We weren't there.
We weren't, but plenty of trees were. We know that carbon-14 production in our atmosphere has not been a constant over time, so the different rate of production is something that has to be accounted for when doing the dating calculation. Using dendrochronology, we have been able to directly measure carbon-14 levels going back 14,000 years. Before that, we used things like atmospheric bubbles in ice cores for calibration, which, again, is a direct measurement of the atmosphere from the past. So, no, we don't just assume that carbon-14 levels have always been as they are today. We correct for different levels. In fact, the way we figured out this was a necessity was when we started carbon dating artifacts of known ages in the 1950s, and the dating results were several centuries too young. So, for older samples from human history, the carbon dates are, if uncorrected for, too young. And here stands John Morris Pendleton to tell us that all the dates that we have obtained from carbon dating are too old. I'd like to see the data he's working from.
What we do know is things that we know their age, carbon-14 fails to give the right age.
How much do you want to bet that he's going to use the carbon dating of marine organisms as his examples now? It's an easy enough thing to do. If you're a creationist and you're looking to have a sample dated, you just send the sample to a lab to get carbon dated. You don't tell them it's a marine sample, and they just use a regular calibration curve instead of any of the marine calibration curves, which are all different depending on the location, as they can be affected by several factors like water depth, latitude, shape of the coastline, wind, seafloor topography, local climate, and more.
For example, there was a seal that had been dead for 30 years when its carcass was tested with carbon-14, gave an age of death of 4,600 years. A seal recently killed gave an age of 1,300 years.
Yeah, seals. Marine organisms. Why the vast difference between the two? Well, they were probably from different locations, and as I mentioned, different marine locations require different calibration curves.
The bark from a living tree gave an age of 10,000 years.
Yeah, that claim gets repeated over and over again in the creationist publications, but while they usually do provide a citation for it, it's Bruno Huber's 1958 paper called Recording Gaseous Exchange Under Field Conditions, published in the Physiology of Forest Trees, I can't for the life of me find the actual paper. The paper has been cited a bunch of times, but the paper itself seems to have not been digitized. The papers that are citing that one seem mostly to be using a method developed by Bruno Huber for measuring CO2 concentrations with infrared light. In fact, going by the title of his paper, I'd say that it was published for the purpose of sharing a method of recording gas exchange under field conditions. This is pure speculation that I can't verify without seeing the paper, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that the 10,000-year age for living tree bark was pointed out as being the result from an erroneous measurement using the method that preceded the one that he was developing. So, like, measuring this way, a tree that is known to be less than 10,000 years old is carbon dating at 10,000 years old, so that's why I developed this new, more accurate method. Again, just to reiterate, I cannot say for certain if that's what it is, but given the creationist penchant for ignoring 99% of a scientific publication to focus on the 1% that seems to agree with them if you remove the context, that wouldn't surprise me in the least.
It was alive. The shell from living snails gave an age of 27,000 years. Some of their membrane and tissue dated at 3,000 years.
The first thing you should know about this is that these are not terrestrial snails. They live in water. But it's not salt water, so the marine reservoir effect is not exactly applicable, but it is a similar idea. The springs that these snails live in are fed by groundwater that flows through channels of Paleozoic carbonate rock. Notice the word carbonate in carbonate rock. It's called that because it is rock that has a lot of carbon in it. The snails that live in these springs build their shells out of bicarbonate that is taken in through their environment, in this case the water that is high in dissolved old carbon. They are literally building their shells out of carbon, meaning that the shells would carbon date older than the organisms are. As to the membrane from the same snails dating at 3,000 years, that appears to be a complete fabrication. The paper that dated the shell to an apparent age of 27,000 years made no mention of dating snail membranes at all, much less from the same snails that were dated to 27,000 years old. On top of that, this whole argument stems from a statement in the paper's abstract. If you read more than just the one sentence of the abstract that gives the date of the snail shell, you'll see that the paper is pointing out some of the known limitations of carbon dating using the snail as an example. In fact, you actually have to stop reading before you get to the end of the sentence that gives the snail's date, because right after it tells how old it dated the snails, it tells you why the dates are so off. They are attributed to a fixation of dissolved HCO3, which is bicarbonate, with which the shells are in carbon isotope equilibrium. Simplified, the bicarbonate is dissolved from old rocks, meaning that the carbon contained within it is old, so will provide old carbon dates. The snails are in isotopic equilibrium with them, meaning they get their proportion of carbon-14 from the bicarbonate rather than from the atmosphere, so their shells will date old just like the bicarbonate. This is the kind of creationist shenanigans I was referring to when I mentioned that they ignored 99% of a publication in order to focus on the 1% that appears to agree with them. In fact, that pretty much tracks here. By word count, the first half of that sentence is about 1.3% of the total number of words, so there you go.
From the other extreme, we have coal from Russia that's supposedly 300 million years old, gave an age of 1,680 years.
I can't find the exact source for this, but it doesn't matter, because the presence of carbon-14 in fossil fuels is well documented. In fact, it is important to find fossil fuels with low amounts of carbon-14 for use in neutrino detectors, so there has actually been quite a bit of work done to figure out how to determine which fossil fuels will have lower amounts of carbon-14. When the C14 decays, it can light up the scintillation fluid, which is the fluid used in the detector. In this case, the fluid has a base of methane or oil. When it lights up because of C14 decay, it gives a false reading. So when studying various fossil fuels to figure out how to predict which ones will have high C14 concentrations and which ones will have low ones, it was found to vary wildly between locations. But these variations correlate pretty closely with variations in uranium-thorium content. Why is that important? Well, remember earlier in the video when John explains that C14 in the atmosphere is produced by nitrogen interacting with cosmic rays? Uranium decay produces the same type of radiation that produces C14 from nitrogen. And since there would have been C14 in the coal at the beginning of its life, there is now nitrogen in it that can interact with radiation from uranium decay to become C14 once more.
Carbon-14 is not reliable for dating things that used to live.
No, it is quite reliable when used correctly and accounting for the variables that we know can affect the results. And to think that you can disprove it by pulling examples out of studies while ignoring the rest of the study that your example came from is just plain ignorant. Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today we're continuing with John Morris Pendleton's presentation where he goes over why he thinks the Earth is only 6,000 years old. So far, it's because he thinks it's possible that people will continue to reproduce beyond the carrying capacity of the universe, and then he read half a sentence from a study that, in isolation, kinda sorta looks like it might support his point if you look at it sideways. Let's see where he goes from here.
On the other extreme, we have a process for dating rocks. This is called Potassium-argon.
Well, it's one of many, but yes, we have many radiometric dating methods.
In 1801, a volcano in Hawaii had an eruption, and the lava flowed and touched the water, stayed in there, solid there.
Well, that's a quotable moment. Let's make a poster out of that. Sorry it's so grainy, but, I can only work with what I have.
They took those samples 167 years later to see how long it had been since the volcano erupted.
Is that why they took those samples? Is it? Because it seems to me that we would have other methods of determining that more reliably. You are also bringing this up in a segment that you started by talking about potassium-argon dating, which is useless at ages below 100,000 years. So why would we take samples from an eruption that is known to be less than 200 years old and date them with a method that is useless under 100,000 years? That doesn't quite add up, does it? Is this another case like the snails from part 1, where you look at just one part of a paper that is actually investigating a known issue with the dating method, so that, we can avoid falling into the trap of using that method incorrectly and coming up with the wrong answer?
We already know 167 years. But with potassium-argon, we got dates between 100 million years to 3 billion years ago that it erupted.
I'd like to see your source for that, because those numbers are well outside the range that I've heard from other creationists making the same argument. Usually this argument stems from this paper called Radiogenic Helium and Argon in Ultramafic Inclusions from Hawaii, which, if you read the paper title carefully, you might be able to see why this argument fails. I'll give you a hint. In geology, an inclusion is any material that is trapped inside a mineral during its formation. What does that mean for a lava flow? It means there are bits of rock crystals in the lava flow that did not melt in the lava, meaning that they are older than the flow itself. Dating these inclusions does not give us a date for the eruption, it gives us the date of the formation of the inclusion. Now, for this particular study, the age range that they found using potassium-argon dating for the inclusions went from 92 million years on the low end to 2.48 billion years on the high end. And actually, if we just limit it to the specific 1801 eruption, only 2 inclusions were dated with potassium-argon, and they gave an age of 1 billion years for one and 2.48 for the other.
And so, as I mentioned, for things that we do know, we find that that also is unreliable.
Even if I ignore the fact that they were dating inclusions rather than the flow itself, using potassium-argon dating on a lava flow that is under 100,000 years old would have yielded an age of 0, because we can't get younger than 100,000 years with potassium-argon. And as it turns out, that same study did, in fact, measure the radiogenic argon within the lava flow itself, and they found none, indicating an age of 0. It's almost like radiometric dating works, but has to be used correctly in order to work correctly. If I buy a bicycle and then get mad that I can't cross the ocean with it, is it the bike's fault or my fault for buying the wrong kind of vehicle? Creationists have their bike, and they are throwing fits because it won't get them across the ocean, blaming everything except their choice of vehicle.
Also in the Grand Canyon, we have lava that has flown over the edge of the canyon, over the rocks, as well as a layer down below that's called the Cardenas, which is volcanic rock. Those two were tested. Obviously, the one that's flowed over the side of the canyon is the much younger lava flow. The one that's way down in one of the rock layers, the Cardenas layer, is obviously much older.
So is that an admission that the laws of stratigraphy are accurate? Usually creationists don't much care for Steno's laws.
But in almost all of the testing that was done, the older one tested out millions of years younger than the younger one.
Not almost all of the testing. The non-creationist affiliated testing gives the younger flow an age of about 1.12 million years, and the older flow gets an age of about 1 billion years. But the creationist testing, carried out by Steve Austin, the stone-cold geologist, came back with an age for the older flow being slightly younger than the younger flow. Now, how did that happen? Well, Austin used samples from 4 different lava flows and 1 phenocryst, which is a large crystal inclusion, which is a big no-no if you want to date one single flow. The way he went about his testing is actually the same method that is sometimes used to figure out the age of the common source for some samples. So when he dated the samples using the isochron diagram, he actually did it accurately for the common source for all the flows, the lithospheric mantle underneath the Grand Canyon. So what Austin did was figure out that the source of all the lava flows for the Grand Canyon is older than the Grand Canyon. That's why his dating came back with a younger age for the older flow. All of the flows will be younger than their source.
And the younger one tested out millions of years older than the older one.
Because he wasn't testing the age of the flow itself, but of the flow's source. Since the younger flow had the same source as the older flow, and he tested the source's age with the younger flow, it makes sense that he came back with an older age from the younger flows. Maybe an analogy would help, this is getting a little bit mixed up in my head at least. A potter makes 5 pots. Now let's imagine that they can be dated exactly, and you can figure out years after the death of the potter exactly which year he made each pot. Now imagine that we could figure out the year the potter was born by examining all 5 of the pots, and we find that the potter was born before he made any of the pots. Is this fact surprising? It shouldn't be. And yeah, I can already hear the creationists attacking me because of my use of imagination for an analogy. So let me just explicitly point out that this potter analogy is a rhetorical device to help people wrap their heads around what I'm talking about, including myself. The source is the potter, the lava flows are the pots, and without imagination, we actually can date the source from an examination of the flows.
And so, consistently we've seen that it's not reliable. The Earth is young.
Hold up there, Sparky. Firstly, you have done nothing to demonstrate that radiometric dating is actually unreliable. In fact, Austin's results rather confirm that it works as expected. But even if you had completely dismantled everything we know about radiometric dating, that would not actually demonstrate that the Earth is young, just that we haven't dated it accurately yet. There are a lot of ways that we know the Earth is old that have nothing to do with radiometric dating. Geologists figured out that the Earth was older than 6,000 years, hundreds of years before radioactivity was even a hypothetical concept.
Some say, well, you need a long period of time to make fossils.
I mean, technically speaking, a fossil is literally just any evidence of an organism that is older than 10,000 years old. There is no particular form that anything has to have in order to be considered a fossil. I mean, hell, we have actual real bone fragments that are not permineralized from dinosaurs. They're still fossils. So what I think you're going for here is that the permineralization process takes a long time rather than fossilization. Not all fossils are permineralized, and not all permineralized artifacts are fossils.
Well, there's lots of fossils out there. Here's one of my favorite ones. This is a cowboy boot. This was found in West Texas. And the right-hand image here, we see that the poor cowboy broke his leg, and his leg and foot stayed inside the boot. They did a scan of the toe section. All 5 toe bones are in there.
Who did a scan? Carl Baugh, the guy known for faking evidence so badly that even other creationists don't want to be associated with him? Because he's the guy that put the boot up in his museum. There are no records of this boot ever having been examined by anyone, just claims that it has been. There is no evidence to suggest that the bone in the boot is permineralized. The boot itself is not permineralized.
It's all fossilized. This was found in the 1980s.
It was claimed to have been found in the 1980s, but yeah, like I said, it has never been examined by anyone. It has just been claimed to have been fossilized. And you said it was completely fossilized? Carl Baugh said that the bone is fossilized, but the boot is not, claiming that this is evidence that the different materials fossilize at different rates, which is actually true, but he got it backward. The softer leather of the boot would have been permineralized much faster than the bone.
This water wheel of wood had water flowing over it. In a matter of 60 years, the wood became petrified wood. It became rock. 60 years, petrified wood. Not millions of years.
Did it become solid rock, or was there just a buildup of minerals caused by water flowing over it? Given that Creation Ministries International says that it became entombed by solid rock, I'm going to go ahead and dismiss your claim that the wood itself has completely gone through the permineralization process. If there were evidence to support that, CMI would have jumped on it. Mineral buildup where there is water is a known phenomenon and can happen quickly. Now, I'm skipping the rest of his examples of young fossilized item. They all have generally the same rebuttal. Either it's a Carl Baugh likely fake, or it's something that is already known to happen quickly, so it doesn't really present an issue. Like I said, not all fossils are permineralized, and not all permineralized artifacts are fossils.
These beautiful gems are called opals. And according to evolutionary theory, it takes millions of years to make opals. Now there's opal mines in a place in Australia, and a opal dealer went and just took some of the powder from these mining areas, placed it in different jars with different acids and chemicals. He is making opals in a matter of months.
Yes, opals can be artificially manufactured fairly quickly, if you give them perfect conditions in which to form. Unfortunately for the creationist argument, perfect lab conditions aren't really reflective of the environment where the opals would have formed naturally. And again, even if you're right, that just means that opals form faster than we thought. It says nothing to the age of the Earth. To the best of my knowledge, no scientist has ever proposed an age for the Earth based on opal dating. Young things exist and sometimes form quickly is not an argument against an old Earth.
Takes millions of years to make opals? Afraid not. Natural processes are able to do it in a matter of months.
Natural processes? Excuse me? Let's go back again and see how you said these were made.
A opal dealer went and just took some of the powder from these mining areas, placed it in different jars with different acids and chemicals. He is making opals in a matter of months.
So if I am to take what you're saying at face value, removing powder from a mine and mixing it in a jar with some chemicals and acids, which I'm sure if I looked into it is a gross oversimplification of what the process actually is, but that's a natural process? How does that even remotely qualify as natural?
I took this picture near Monterrey, Mexico, and what this billboard says in English is publicity for the Garcia Caverns in Monterrey, Mexico. Of course they are brainwashing us.
What was that? Why are you giving your pen a whistly blowjob? And how is the phrase publicity for the Garcia Caverns in Monterrey, Mexico a statement that is supposed to brainwash anyone? I mean, it's hard to make out, but I'm pretty sure I see Millones de Años at the top of that billboard, sorry about the pronunciation. That's Spanish for millions of years, but you seem to have forgotten to translate that part, so I did it for you. I'm helping you point out where they are
brainwashing us.
You're welcome.
What it says is 60 million years of nature, a drop at a time.
Okay, I guess you did translate that part, but why did you even bother with the first part and present that as if that were the statement that is supposed to be
brainwashing us?
It doesn't make much sense. But then, what in this presentation has made sense?
Now, what can we do to protect ourselves?
Use condoms. Now that was use condoms, not used condoms. Those are two very different things.
Well, it's always a good idea to see, what does the Bible have to say? What does God have to say? What counts is there for me?
As to the age of the Earth, the Bible doesn't say diddly squat. It is an interpretation based on a calculation of genealogies that seem to lead back to mythical figures. When a genealogy leads to someone that we know didn't exist, that genealogy ceases to be useful for determining timescales.
In Job 38:4, God is questioning Job, and he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding."
So God quoted Ken Ham with a fancy version of, "Were you there?" Okay, yeah, I wasn't there, but I have more understanding about the formation of the Earth than the Bible does. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, it's purely a product of the times. I live in a time where almost everybody has a better understanding of where the Earth came from than those who lived when the Bible was written.
What I'm proposing is this, and many have found it effective. The next time somebody in your hearing says something in something millions of years, you, with courtesy, raise your hand, ask to speak, and say, "Excuse me, were you there? Did you set a clock? Did you register this amount of time?"
No, but the rocks were there, and they set a clock.
You see, a lot of people just keep repeating millions of years without even realizing where it comes from.
It comes from science. Many sciences, actually. Geochronology, cosmology, astronomy. Dendrochronology doesn't quite get us back to millions of years, but it certainly gets us farther back than you think the universe existed. And then the study of ice cores, which gets us back to about 2.7 million years, and there's more.
They just assume that it's right, but not knowing that it's actually wrong.
So, the scientists who constantly test different radiometric dating methods on different materials formed in different environments to see if they can suss out any problems with the method are just blindly assuming that their methods are correct? The scientists that you referenced in this very talk, the ones writing papers about excess radiogenic argon being found and needing to be accounted for, the ones writing papers about the reservoir effect and the deficiency of carbon-14 in animals that were expected to have higher levels, and pointing out that these situations need to be accounted for, these guys are just assuming that it's correct? Never mind the rest of the paper that comes after the first half of the first sentence of the abstract. That one sentence fragment is all that we need to prove that these scientists are just assuming that their dating methods are correct. Give me a break.
So let's give a little practice. I'll count to 3, and even though you're watching through video, you say it too, will you? Just to get in the habit of it. Were you there? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Were you there? Of course they are brainwashing us. Now some people say, oh John, I could never do that. Why not? Well, what if they turn the question on me? Well, were you there? What should I tell them? Well, tell them that you weren't there. I tell them I wasn't there. I said, but a good friend of mine was there, and he's left me a record of everything that he saw, that happened, that he did, and to date he hasn't failed in anything.
Can you introduce me to this friend? No? Your friend can't be seen or heard in a way that is independently verifiable? How convenient.
Really? Who's your friend? My Heavenly Father. And what's the record? The Bible.
Because the book that tells you how much you can beat your slaves is the best book to go to figure out the age of the Earth. That's basically it. He just goes through more things that in nature can take a while to form, but people have successfully done it in a lab fairly quickly. So this is the end for Johnny Boy. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Aldiha, who says, I just want to point out that his quote about let no man separate was in answer to a very direct and specific question about divorce. Does he ever state that divorce should be illegal? I doubt it. This was on the first part of my recent video responding to a guy complaining that same-sex marriage has been affirmed by the US Supreme Court. And yeah, I never really thought to look up the context of that verse for whatever reason, but it is a direct response to Jesus being asked by a Pharisee if it is lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause. So again, if we want to put biblical rules into law, that means that it should be illegal to divorce for anything other than adultery. But you'll never find a religious group lobbying for this, possibly because of the higher divorce rate among evangelicals than among the general population. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my PayPal donors, Nico and Stuart, and my patrons, David Schinkel, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are
brainwashing us.
If you'd like to brainwash us, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!